What happens when you lock away the ocean's top predator and try to train it like a circus act? The answer is always the same: tragedy, horror, and blood in the water. 3 people. 3 horrifying deaths, all witnessed by stunned audiences who thought they were there to see a family show. On a cold February evening in 1991, inside the Sealand of the Pacific Marine Park in Victoria, British Columbia, a young woman slipped and fell into the water. Her name was Keltie Byrne. She was only 20 years old, a student at the University of Victoria, a competitive swimmer, and someone who had taken a part-time job at the park to help pay her way through school. Bright, athletic, and full of life, she wasn't supposed to be in danger around the animals she cared for. But that night, everything changed. The pool she fell into didn't just hold one whale. It had 3 massive orcas, Haida 2, Nootka 4, and the youngest, a 12,000-pound male named Tilikum. The audience watched in horror as Keltie screamed and tried to swim to the edge, but the whales wouldn't let her. One clamped onto her foot, dragging her under. Each time she surfaced, gasping for air, desperate hands threw a life ring, but the orcas blocked her path, yanking her back beneath the surface. Witnesses remembered the terror in her voice as she surfaced again and again, fighting for her life. 3 times she managed to break through the water. On the 4th, she never came back up. Hours later, her body was pulled out with a net. The coroner called it an accident, but anyone who was there knew differently. This wasn't a slip or a fall. This was the first time an orca in captivity had killed a human, and it should have been the last. Keltie Byrne's death should have been the end of Tilikum's career, maybe even the end of keeping killer whales in tiny tanks altogether. It was a glaring, bloody warning sign. But SeaWorld didn't see a killer. They saw an opportunity. Instead of retiring Tilikum, they bought him. To them, he wasn't a danger. He was an investment. A 22-foot-long, 12,000-pound spectacle they could put on stage to wow audiences and rake in millions. The corporate machine kept running, and the crowds kept buying tickets. Which is why, just a few years later, Tilikum struck again. 8 years passed after Keltie Byrne's horrifying death. By then, Tilikum had been shipped to Florida, the crown jewel of SeaWorld Orlando. Families packed the stadiums, kids screamed with joy, and nobody seemed to remember the blood that had once stained his pool. But Tilikum hadn't forgotten. On the night of July 6, 1999, a 27-year-old man named Daniel Dukes slipped into the park after closing. He was a drifter, a free spirit with a troubled past, known for his love of nature, but also for petty thefts and wandering from place to place. For reasons no one will ever fully understand, he made his way to Tilikum's tank. Maybe he was fascinated by the massive animal. Perhaps he just wanted to be close to something bigger than himself. By morning, staff found Duke's lifeless body draped across Tilikum's back as the whale swam in slow circles. The sight was beyond chilling, as if the killer whale was parading its victim. The official story from SeaWorld was simple. Dukes had drowned, but the autopsy told a darker truth. His body was bruised, battered, mutilated. His genitals had been bitten off. Yet there was no security footage. SeaWorld claimed the cameras hadn't been running that night. Convenient, isn't it? The public reaction? Barely a ripple. SeaWorld painted Dukes as nothing more than a trespasser who had gotten what he deserved. The crowds kept coming. The shows went on. But this was Tilikum's second victim, and the world ignored it. 2 lives. 2 brutal warnings, and still nothing changed. SeaWorld kept selling tickets, parents kept bringing their kids, and audiences kept cheering. The machine of profit roared louder than the cries of the dead. And because no one stopped it, the stage was set for the most horrifying tragedy of all. By 2010, nearly 2 decades had passed since Keltie Byrne's death. Daniel Dukes was already a forgotten footnote, but inside SeaWorld Orlando, the stadium lights still gleamed, the music still blared, and the shows never stopped. Families lined up for the famous Dine with Shamu experience, never suspecting they were sitting inches away from a predator with blood on his record. On February 24, 2010, trainer Dawn Brancheau finished a routine performance with Tilikum. She was 40 years old, one of SeaWorld's most respected trainers, admired by her colleagues and adored by audiences. For more than a decade, Dawn had been the smiling face of SeaWorld's shows, poised, graceful, the very image of harmony between human and whale. That illusion shattered in seconds. As the crowd filed out, Dawn lingered by the pool's edge, rubbing Tilikum as part of their post-show ritual. Witnesses later described a blur of motion, the massive orca lunging, seizing her. Some said he grabbed her ponytail, others swore it was her arm. But the result was the same. Tilikum yanked her into the water with unimaginable force. In front of stunned families, he thrashed her violently, dragging her under, then hurling her body back to the surface. Her screams were swallowed by the water. The details are almost too gruesome to speak aloud. Dawn was scalped. One of her arms was torn away. Her body was battered until the autopsy confirmed she died from drowning, combined with blunt force trauma. For 17 excruciating minutes, trainers tried to save her, but the 12,000-pound whale refused to let go. When it was finally over, SeaWorld's star trainer was gone, killed before an audience that would never forget what they saw. And this time, the world could no longer look away. Dawn Brancheau's death sent shockwaves far beyond SeaWorld's gates. This wasn't a trespasser in the dead of night, or a young trainer at a little-known Canadian park. This was SeaWorld's most trusted veteran, killed in broad daylight, in front of paying guests, right at the heart of America's most famous marine park. The media descended like sharks. Headlines screamed of a killer whale attack. Lawsuits piled up. Regulators demanded answers. SeaWorld scrambled to save its image, insisting Dawn's death was a tragic accident, not proof that something was fundamentally broken. But the illusion was cracking. In 2013, the documentary Blackfish detonated like a bomb. Millions of people who once saw orca shows as wholesome family fun suddenly saw the dark truth. Trainers testified about cover-ups, aggression, and the psychological torment these animals endured. Tilikum's past, his role in Keltie Byrne's death, Daniel Dukes' mutilation, and now Dawn's horrific end were laid bare for the world. Crowds that once cheered now turned away. Musicians canceled SeaWorld concerts. Attendance dropped. For the first time, the world was asking, should orcas even be kept in captivity at all? For nearly 2 decades, the world saw Tilikum as a monster. The killer whale dragged a young woman to her death. The shadowy figure is swimming with a mutilated trespasser on his back. The beast that tore apart SeaWorld's star trainer in front of a horrified audience. But peel back the surface, and another story emerges. Tilikum wasn't born in a tank. He was born in the icy waters off Iceland in 1981, part of a thriving pod where he should have spent his life hunting, playing, and roaming hundreds of miles of open ocean. At just 2 years old, nets dropped into the water. He was ripped away from his family, never to see them again. From that moment on, his life was confined. His first stop was a barren tank in Iceland. Then came Sealand of the Pacific, where 2 older females, Haida 2 and Nootka 4, bullied him relentlessly. They raked his skin with their teeth until he bled. Trainers often locked him in a pen barely bigger than his own body, just to keep him safe. In the wild, orcas swim 100 miles a day. Tilikum swam circles so small he could complete a lap in less than 30 seconds. Orcas are social, intelligent, emotional beings. Isolation drives them mad. Trainers and scientists later described captive whales showing symptoms eerily similar to human PTSD: depression, aggression, and even self-harm. Tilikum lived like that for 34 years. 3 decades of tanks, lights, tricks, and breeding. Instead of freedom, he was turned into SeaWorld's chief sperm bank, fathering 21 calves, many of whom would die young. Tilikum killed 3 people. But the real killer? The tiny tank that drove him insane. SeaWorld bought a killer whale and put him on stage for 20 years. They used him for shows, for profit, and even as a sperm bank, fathering calves that were destined for the same misery. But here's the thing. SeaWorld wasn't alone in this. Every ticket bought, every family that cheered kept Tilikum locked up. If people had boycotted after Keltie Byrne's death, Daniel Dukes might still be alive. If they had turned away after Dukes, Don Brancheau may never have been pulled under. Tilikum died in 2017, floating lifeless in a tank until a lung infection finally ended his suffering. He was branded a killer, but in truth, he was also a victim. So who's responsible? The corporation? The trainers? Or the millions of us who paid to watch? The truth is brutal. When you cage what was never meant to be caged, blood will always follow.